A machine just told a room full of Bible scholars that some of the most famous religious manuscripts on Earth are older than anyone believed. Not by a few years. In some cases, by centuries. And it didn't reach that conclusion by guessing. It reached it by studying the handwriting of dead men, letter by letter, in a way no human eye has ever been able to do. This is not a movie plot. This actually happened, and it's still happening in a lab in the Netherlands right now. Stick around, because by the end of this you're going to look at the Bible and at the idea of an original sacred text completely differently. Let's go back to where this all starts, because the story is almost too strange to be true. In the spring of 1947, in the hills above the Dead Sea, a Bedouin teenager named Muhammad Abdib was tending goats near a place called Qumran. One of the animals wandered off, and he went looking for it. He found a hole in a cliffside, tossed a rock inside to see if the goat had wandered in, and instead of a thud of stone on stone, he heard something break. Curious, and probably a little nervous, he climbed in. Inside were tall clay jars, and inside those jars were scrolls, rolled leather and parchment, wrapped and sealed and left untouched for nearly 2,000 years. He had just stumbled onto what would become one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Over the following decade, archaeologists and Bedouin treasure hunters alike combed the cliffs around Qumran and found more caves, more jars, more scrolls. By the time the dust settled, roughly 15,000 fragments had been recovered from 11 caves, representing hundreds of separate manuscripts. Some fragments were large, whole columns of text you could actually read. Most were small. Some were smaller than a fingernail, a handful of shriveled letters on a scrap of leather that had spent 2,000 years in a hot, dry cave. Almost every book of the Hebrew Bible showed up somewhere in that pile, some in multiple copies, some centuries older than any biblical manuscript previously known to exist. Before Qumran, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible manuscript scholars had dated to around the 9th or 10th century AD. Suddenly, they were holding fragments that could be 1,000 years older than that. It's hard to overstate how big a deal that was. It meant, for the first time, scholars could compare the Bible people read today against copies made centuries before Christianity even existed. But here's the problem nobody likes to talk about. Finding the scrolls was the easy part. Reading them turned into one of the slowest, most frustrating academic projects of the last century. The scrolls didn't come out of those caves as neat books. Most of them came out as confetti. Fragile leather and papyrus that had been rolled up for 2 millennia crumbled the moment it was touched. Scholars ended up with tens of thousands of tiny scraps that had to be sorted, matched, and pieced back together like the world's most important, most fragile jigsaw puzzle, except nobody had the picture on the box. They sorted fragments by the color and thickness of the leather. They compared the spacing between lines. They studied the shape of individual letters, trying to figure out which scraps had been written by the same hand. A single verse might be split across 4 fragments, sitting in 3 different museums in 2 different countries, and for decades nobody would even realize those pieces belonged together, because no one scholar could hold the entire 15,000 fragment archive in their head at once. On top of that, access to the scrolls was tightly controlled for years. A small circle of researchers held exclusive rights to publish certain texts, and some fragments sat unpublished in drawers for decades while outside scholars weren't even allowed to see photographs of them. It wasn't until the early 1990s, more than 40 years after the first discovery, that the full collection became broadly accessible to researchers. Even after that opened up, the sheer scale of the material meant that piecing together the full picture, every scribe, every variant, every relationship between fragments, was simply beyond what any team of humans could finish in a normal career. That's the wall this field has been running into for 75 years. Not a lack of evidence, but a lack of any way to hold all of that evidence in view at the same time. Before we get to the machines, it's worth pausing on just how strange and layered this desert actually is. The cliffs above the Dead Sea are riddled with caves, some shallow and easy to reach, others tucked so deep into sheer rock faces that even experienced climbers hesitate before going in. For centuries, local shepherds and travelers had almost certainly wandered past these openings without a second thought. There was nothing about the landscape to suggest that some of the most consequential documents in religious history were sitting a few dozen meters away, sealed in clay and wrapped in linen, waiting. Once word of the first discovery spread, both professional archaeologists and local Bedouin treasure hunters began combing the region, and for a while it became something of a race, with fragments occasionally changing hands on the antiquities market before scholars even had a chance to study them properly. That chaotic, competitive early period is part of why the field ended up so fragmented for so long, with different institutions holding different pieces of what should really have been treated as one single, unified body of evidence. That's where the machines come in, and I want to be careful here, because this part of the story is genuinely happening, but it isn't as instant or as sci-fi as some viral posts make it sound. This isn't a story about a single AI that swallowed all 25,000 fragments overnight and spat out the secrets of the Bible in 96 hours. It's slower and, honestly, more impressive than that because it's real, peer-reviewed, published science, done over years by a team who has been transparent about exactly what their tools can and can't do. The story really starts to accelerate in 2021 when a research group at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, led by Professor Mladen Popovic, published a study that used artificial intelligence to examine one of the most famous scrolls ever found, the Great Isaiah Scroll, a nearly complete copy of the Book of Isaiah and one of the best-preserved manuscripts from Qumran. For decades, the working assumption was that this scroll, with its remarkably steady, uniform handwriting, was the work of a single trained scribe from start to finish. Popovic's team, working with computer scientists Maruf Daly and Lambert Showmaker, trained pattern recognition software to study the scroll at a level of detail no human paleographer could manage by eye. Instead of just looking at whole letters, the software broke each character down into tiny fragments of ink strokes, essentially a microscopic fingerprint of how a hand moved across the page. The pressure, the curve, the tiny habitual quirks a person doesn't even know they have when they write. When they ran the full scroll through this analysis, the software found something nobody expected, a genuine, statistically significant shift partway through the manuscript. The handwriting in the second half of the scroll was subtly, consistently different from the first half. Two scribes, not one, had produced this scroll, writing so similarly to each other that for 70 years, some of the sharpest paleographers alive had read it as the work of a single hand. It's worth explaining briefly how a computer even does something like this, because it's genuinely clever. Traditional paleography relies on a trained human eye comparing whole letter forms, essentially asking, does this aleph look like that aleph? That works, but it's slow, and it's vulnerable to the fact that human perception is easily fooled by overall similarity even when small, consistent differences are hiding underneath. The Groningen team's software instead broke each letter down into microscopic fragments of contour and stroke, tiny geometric shapes that make up the ink trace itself, then used statistical pattern recognition to compare thousands of these microfeatures across the whole manuscript at once, without any assumption about who wrote what. It's less like reading and more like fingerprint analysis, measuring things a human eye would never consciously register. The exact curvature where a stroke begins, the pressure implied by ink thickness, the habitual rhythm of how a particular hand moved from one letter to the next. That approach is precisely what let the model catch a difference, so subtle that decades of expert human review had missed it entirely. That finding didn't rewrite theology, but it did something arguably more valuable. It proved, for the first time with hard statistical evidence, that these texts were being produced through collaboration, through a scribal culture of multiple trained people working in close coordination, carefully mimicking one another's style. The Bible's earliest known copies were, quite literally, team efforts. While that research was unfolding in the Netherlands, something extraordinary was happening back in the actual caves of the Judean desert. In 2017, the Israel Antiquities Authority launched a large-scale operation to survey hundreds of caves along the cliffs of the Dead Sea, racing against looters who had been quietly stripping unexplored sites for years and selling fragments on the black market. One of the caves they targeted was a place nicknamed the Cave of Horror, a site so difficult to reach that archaeologists had to be lowered 80 meters down a sheer cliff face on ropes to get inside. The cave earned its grim nickname decades earlier, in the 1950s and 60s, When excavators found the remains of around 40 people inside, men, women, and children who are believed to have fled there during the Bar Kokhba revolt, the doomed Jewish uprising against Rome that raged from 132 to 136 AD. When the revolt collapsed and Roman forces swept through the region, families scattered into the cliffs, hoping the terrain would hide them. It's a genuinely sobering sight, and archaeologists have treated it that way. In March of 2021, the IAA announced that its team had found something new in that cave, roughly 80 fresh fragments of a biblical scroll, the first new Dead Sea Scroll material discovered in that region in over 60 years. The fragments preserved parts of the Book of the 12, the collection known as the Minor Prophets, specifically passages from Nahum and Zechariah. The remarkable part wasn't just that they'd found more scripture. It was the language. These fragments weren't written in Hebrew or Aramaic. They were written in Greek, with only the name of God rendered in an older Paleo-Hebrew script tucked into the Greek text. That detail tells you something real about the people who carried these scrolls into hiding. They were part of a Hellenized Jewish community, people whose everyday language, even for reading scripture, was Greek, the language of the wider Mediterranean world, and, not incidentally, the language of the empire that was hunting them. The picture of an isolated, purely Hebrew-speaking religious world simply doesn't hold up next to this evidence. And when researchers, including Dr. Oren Abelman of the IAA's Dead Sea Scrolls Unit, compared this newly found Greek text against the later, standardized Greek translation of the Bible that most people know, they found real differences, not copying mistakes, but genuine variations in wording. In one line, for instance, a phrase that later standard translations render as in your gates appeared instead as in your streets, a small shift, but the kind of detail that tells scholars this wasn't simply a sloppy copy of an already fixed text. It was an independent branch of the same living tradition, evolving on its own path. As Joe Uziel, who heads the IAA's Dead Sea Scrolls Unit, put it at the time, people tend to picture the biblical text as something fixed and static, but it wasn't. There were slight differences across versions, and some of those differences mattered. That's not a fringe theory. That's the head of Israel's own Dead Sea Scrolls research program saying it, on the record, based on a text pulled out of a cave where people died hiding from Rome. It's worth remembering, too, that the scroll fragments weren't the only things pulled from that cave during the 2017-era survey effort. Archaeologists also recovered coins bearing Jewish rebel symbols, arrowheads and spear tips from the period of the revolt, fragments of cloth, sandals, and even a woven basket dated to roughly 10,500 years old, thousands of years older than the scroll fragments themselves, showing the cave had been used and reused across an almost unimaginable span of human history. All of it had to be excavated under brutal conditions, with teams rappelling down cliff faces and working in narrow, dust-choked spaces, racing against looters who were doing the exact same thing with far less care. Now here's where the two threads, the AI research and the physical discoveries, start to weave together into the story that's really been making headlines lately. In June of 2025, Popovich's team at Groningen published a new study in the journal PLOS1 that pushed their AI work even further. They built a machine learning model they named Enoch, after the biblical figure associated with ancient wisdom and hidden knowledge. Enoch was trained on a combination of two things: radiocarbon dating results from 24 scroll fragments that had been physically tested to determine their age, and detailed handwriting analysis of those same fragments, the shape of the letters, the ink strokes, the character spacing. By combining hard physical dating with the visual fingerprint of a scribe's handwriting, the model learned to estimate the age of other undated manuscripts just by analyzing how they were written, essentially letting the AI cross-reference thousands of tiny handwriting features against a known timeline. The team then tested Enoch against a set of 135 Dead Sea Scroll fragments and had human paleography experts independently evaluate how realistic its age estimates were. The experts judged that Enoch's predictions were realistic for around 80% of the scrolls tested, correctly placing many of them within a plausible historical window without needing to physically damage the manuscript at all, which matters, because radiocarbon dating requires cutting a small physical sample out of the parchment, destroying a tiny piece of an irreplaceable artifact every time you test it. What Enoch found, in several cases, was that certain scrolls previously assumed to be from the 1st century AD or later may actually date back much earlier, in some instances closer to 200 years before Christ, putting them closer in time to the actual authors traditionally associated with certain biblical books. That matters more than it might sound at first. Dating a manuscript closer to the lifetime of its presumed author changes how scholars think about how quickly a text was copied, circulated, and stabilized after it was first written, and how many generations of hand-to-hand transmission might separate a given scroll from whatever the very first version looked like. Popovich was careful to frame this correctly when speaking to the press. He said flatly that AI needs human beings, especially in its development, comparing the model to a microscope, a powerful tool for a specialist, not a replacement for the specialist. He also pointed out one of the quieter, more practical benefits of this approach. Radiocarbon dating, the traditional gold standard for aging organic material like parchment, requires physically cutting a small sample away from the manuscript and destroying it in the process. For an artifact as rare and fragile as a 2,000-year-old scroll fragment, that's a real cost every time. A handwriting-based AI model like Enoch doesn't need to touch the object at all. It just needs a good image. That's an important detail because a lot of what circulates online about this research strips out exactly that kind of caution and turns a careful, peer-reviewed method into something that sounds like a mystical revelation machine. It isn't that. It's genuinely useful statistical pattern recognition, built and checked by actual historians, radiocarbon scientists, and computer scientists working together. And the work isn't slowing down. In the summer of 2026, Popovich's group announced their next phase, a 5-year international project called Tracing Scribes and Scrolls, backed by a €2.5 million grant from the European Research Council and run jointly with the Israel Antiquities Authority and several other European research institutions. This next stage goes beyond simply identifying who wrote a given scroll or how old it is. The goal now is to figure out where these scribes were actually working, what materials and inks they used, and how ideas and texts moved between different communities scattered across the ancient Near East. Researchers across Groningen, the Israel Antiquities Authority, and universities in Pisa, Naples, and Odense are combining chemical analysis of the ink and parchment with the AI-driven handwriting work and traditional paleography to try to map out something no one has ever mapped before: the actual social and geographic network of the people who copied the Hebrew Bible into existence. So, what does all of this actually add up to? Not a scandal. Not a hidden conspiracy some shadowy institution tried to bury. What it adds up to is something quieter and, honestly, more human. For a long time, the popular image of the Dead Sea Scrolls was of a single, isolated religious community, often assumed to be the Essenes, sitting out in the desert at Qumran, copying their sacred texts in one unbroken chain, generation after generation. What the combined evidence, the AI handwriting analysis, the cave of horror discoveries, the growing catalog of textual variants actually points to is something messier and more alive. Multiple scribes, multiple communities, multiple languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and an older ceremonial Paleo-Hebrew script used the way we might use fancy calligraphy today, all producing and circulating versions of scripture that didn't always agree word for word. Corrections were made in the margins. Words were rewritten. Later readers added their own notes when they disagreed with what an earlier scribe had written. That's not a flaw in the story of the Bible. That is the story of the Bible, at least in its earliest centuries, a living text, actively read, copied, debated, and revised by real people long before any council or authority sat down and declared one specific version the final, official one. There's one more detail worth sitting with, because it's true, it's well documented, and it doesn't need any AI to make it fascinating. Among the roughly 15,000 Dead Sea Scroll fragments recovered since 1947, representing pieces of nearly every book in the Hebrew Bible, not a single fragment of the Book of Esther has ever turned up. Scholars have debated why for decades. Some think it's simply an accident of survival, that a copy existed somewhere and just never made it into the caves that were found, or was lost to time and looting like so much else. Others point to features of Esther itself, the fact that it never mentions God directly, and wonder if the Qumran community deliberately didn't preserve it because it didn't fit their particular religious outlook. Nobody actually knows. The gap might be a loss. It might be a choice. And that uncertainty is a pretty good summary of what